I'm Mike Scipione at the Addison Historical Museum, and with me is Jonathan Sebastian, who is portraying August Fisher, the son of Conrad Fisher, one of Addison Township's first settlers. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Of course.
So if you could tell us, who was August Fisher and what was life like for the Fisher family when they first settled around these parts about 200 years ago now?
Yeah, hard to believe it's been quite that long. Actually, August's uncle, Christian Fisher, was the very first to come into this immediate area, coming here in the year 1834 and making the land claim. And it was a particularly large claim, as much land as you could plow a furrow around in a day. And the original Fisher claim stretched from what is now the Cook County DuPage line westward out here to Salt Creek, and from Lake Street north to the section line just north of Grand Avenue. And they did purchase up to 750 acres of that land. But the rest of the family came over about 2 years later in 1836. That would be Conrad Fisher, his wife Louisa, and their remaining 5 children came over with them at that time. Now, August was the youngest son in the family. There were 3 sons. Henry was the oldest, John was the middle son, and August was the youngest son. But August inherited the middle part of the property. Conrad divided into 3 parts, one for each of the sons, not to confuse you. But the youngest son got the middle part of the property, which is actually where the original homestead was. That remains still as Fisher Farm today, if you're familiar, on Grand Avenue, just to the east of where we are right now, fronting on Grand Avenue, just north of that intersection of Grand Avenue, Lake Street, and Route 83. And what was it like? Well, this area was almost entirely unsettled in terms of white settlers that hadn't come into this area yet. It remained prairie where we're standing. So pretty much from here south was all prairie. There was some forest to the north, especially right along the banks of Salt Creek. And then some of the areas were kind of wet that might merit the name of wetland, but primarily prairie in this immediate area. And they set about working to build a farm. Now, they were so early in their case that they may have actually established sort of a wheat or grain farm initially, but then quickly turned to dairy farming. And really a lot of the other settlers that came in, also of German origin, established their own dairy farms in this immediate area, stretching as far north from here as Arlington Heights, and a little bit further south from here towards the Elmhurst area was all dairy farms, if you can try to picture that. It's a little hard now with the magnitude of the development, especially in the eastern half of DuPage County here adjacent to Cook County, but this was open in terms of that, like I said, prairie or forest, and they worked to create these dairy farms. And so in the case of the Fishers, they had dairy cows, obviously, and horses on the farm, but they had chickens and pigs and ducks and geese as well there, and they worked to sell the milk and the eggs and the butter in Chicago.
Now, as far as the other brothers, was August maybe like one of the more successful of the family? I mean, is that why he's more notable for his contributions, possibly, or was Henry and John as equally successful with their business ventures?
Perhaps. I think the one reason is because the Fisher farm that we know that survives today on that parcel of the Forest Preserve on Grand Avenue was his part of the dairy farm. And so we have that. But his older brother was actually, Henry was just as involved, if not more so, in some of the development of the area, and ran a very successful dairy farm on the western part of that property, and I'm sure they worked together and helped each other. As for the middle brother, I'm not 100% sure. I don't know that they ever actually bought that parcel all the way to the east, because that was, or rather they did, but that was the first part that they sold. So I don't think he ever lived on that part. So east of York Road over to County Line, in the area where the Mount Emblem Cemetery is to the south of Grand, and the River Forest Country Club to the north was sold off earliest. And I believe John actually took a job in Chicago for a while, so presumably was successful in what he did. But the oldest brother, Henry, was a Addison Township supervisor for a while. He served as the Justice of the Peace here in this area, county sheriff for a little while, and served in some of the other township offices, road commissioner and some other things. And both he and his brother August were both on the committee, the original committee, you might say, to establish the first school district here in Addison Township, the result of which is the Fisher or Churchville one-room schoolhouse that still stands on Church Road, just north of Grand Avenue. That was built in the year 1851, and that's the forerunner of Elmhurst School District 205. So we do know that as well. And August obviously donated that parcel of the land. And then they were just involved in the community development, first of Addison here, and then later of what would be Bensonville.
Right. And a lot of their business, like from the dairy farm, they would kind of go into the Chicagoland selling their products. Did that business kind of thrive? Was it passed down to the generations at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they had a particularly large dairy farm out of the farms that are here. And I mean, by the end of August time when he was giving it over to his son, I mean, he was running as many as 80 dairy cows in their herd. And that's a lot to do all by hand without any milking machines or modern milking parlor that we know today. But he had 80 dairy cows. So if you can imagine when you're on Grand Avenue and Lake Street there, if you can imagine 80 dairy cows wandering there, that's what it would have looked like in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s time frame there, even up to the turn of the century. But yes, originally they would have gone, as the other families did before the railroad was constructed. They would load their product into wagons as often as twice a week, and they would go all the way down Grand Avenue to what is now downtown Chicago, and they would sell there to the residents of Chicago, and that would be the eggs, the milk, the butter, and sometimes cheese, although that was usually in one of the small factories around here, either here in Addison or Bensonville.
Is there any kind of information on other family members after August, maybe his lineage, that continued the business at all, or?
Yeah, so he handed it over to, interestingly enough, his youngest son, Charles. I guess the older sons had enough of that. I don't know, went on to other work, but August gave it to his youngest son, Charles, who continued to farm that part of the land, and then it went to one of his sons, Arthur, who continued to farm it on smaller and smaller scale, but all the way until the early 1960s, actually, on some of that property.
Yeah. Now, if people wanted to research more about any, the early settlers, any kind of, just research in general about, learning more about the history, are there any particular resources that you could recommend to the residents for finding more about the history about it?
So there's two for this community on Addison: the Village of Friendship, and then Addison, The Vision Continues. So those are good books. You can find those books in your local library here too. Stop by the museum right here, the Addison Historical Museum. Come by, visit the museum. They have some great stuff here in the collection. I mean, I started my research actually here at this museum, so there's stuff to see here. There's also, as I said, that remaining parcel of Fisher Farm that has the original structures on it. You can go and walk around the property and actually see these structures, see the original log home that the Fishers built, and that would have been similar to what the other earliest settlers built, that original log house constructed in November of 1836, and then their first barn built in the summer of 1837 with the other farm structures there as well. And then the one-room schoolhouse just to the north on Grand Avenue, as I said, built in 1851. And if I could shamelessly say, I wrote a book in the Arcadia series, the Images of America series, Bensonville, and that has information on the Fishers and some of this development just to the south of Bensonville proper that was called Churchville, and right along Grand Avenue and Lake Street there as well. So there's some sources out there, yeah.
Fantastic. Now, is there a way that some of the residents maybe can interact with you or try to find a copy of your book? Maybe write you on Facebook if they have any questions, possibly. Or
I do actually have a Facebook page.
Okay.
You can just look me right up on the Facebook page. Hopefully you would find me there, Jonathan Sebastian. I work at the Elmhurst History Museum, and I also work at the Arlington Heights History Museum. So active and involved in some of these surrounding communities with the local history here. So if you were to stop into one of these museums or even into Addison, we could probably get you in touch with me. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. This has been great.